The fishing boats had already returned to shore by the time the sun climbed high over the Sea of Galilee, their hulls scraping against the dark basalt stones that lined Capernaum's waterfront. It was a town that smelled of salt and commerce, of dried fish packed in barrels and the sweat of labourers hauling cargo from one territory to another. Capernaum sat precisely where it needed to sit, on the border between the tetrarchy of Herod Antipas and the lands governed by his half-brother Philip, a geographical accident that had transformed this modest fishing village into something more consequential. A customs station operated near the water's edge, where tax collectors extracted tolls from merchants crossing between jurisdictions. Roman soldiers garrisoned nearby kept an uneasy peace. Perhaps 1,500 souls called this place home, crowded into tightly packed stone houses with flat roofs and shared courtyards, their lives intertwined in the intimate way of small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, everyone else's struggles, and everyone else's shame. It was here, in this unremarkable town on the northwestern shore of Galilee, that a carpenter's son from Nazareth had chosen to establish the centre of his ministry. Jesus had moved to Capernaum after his own hometown rejected him, and the village had become something it never expected to be, the epicentre of a movement that was drawing crowds from across the region and whispers from as far as Jerusalem. The synagogue where the townspeople gathered each Sabbath had witnessed things that defied explanation. A man with an unclean spirit had been delivered within its walls. Peter's mother-in-law had been healed of a burning fever just steps away. The paralytic lowered through a roof had walked out carrying his mat, his sins pronounced forgiven by a man who spoke as though he had the authority to forgive sins. Capernaum had seen miracles, and Capernaum had seen controversy, and the man responsible for both had just returned from across the lake. Among those who had watched these events unfold with growing attention was a man named Jairus. He was not a fisherman like Peter or Andrew. He was not a tax collector like Matthew, who had abandoned his booth by the customs station to follow the teacher. Jairus held a position of considerable honour in this small community. He was the ruler of the synagogue, the archysynagogos, the man responsible for the orderly conduct of Sabbath services and the maintenance of the building where his neighbours gathered to hear the Torah read and expounded. It was not a role for the young or the insignificant. The synagogue ruler was chosen from among the respected elders, a man of demonstrated piety and administrative competence, someone trusted to select which members of the congregation would read from the scrolls, to ensure that visiting teachers were properly vetted, to mediate disputes and maintain the dignity of sacred space. Jairus had earned this position through years of faithful service, through his reputation for wisdom and his evident devotion to the God of Israel. His home was comfortable, his standing secure, his future predictable, or so it had seemed until his daughter fell ill. She was 12 years old, this girl whose name the Gospel writers never recorded, and she was the only daughter Jairus had. The Greek word Luke would later use to describe her, monogenes, carried weight that no English translation quite captures. It was the same word the scriptures used for Isaac, the beloved son of Abraham, the child of promise upon whom an entire covenant hung. It was the same word John would use for Jesus himself, the only begotten of the Father. To call her his only daughter was to say that she was irreplaceable, that in her small frame resided all of Jairus' hopes for his family's continuation, all his dreams of grandchildren and legacy, and the simple joy of watching his child grow into womanhood. At 12, she stood on the threshold of that womanhood. Jewish custom considered this the age when a girl became responsible for keeping the commandments, when marriage contracts might be negotiated, when childhood gave way to the serious business of establishing a household. She had her whole life ahead of her, and then, without warning, she did not. The illness came suddenly, as childhood illnesses so often did in a world without antibiotics or hospitals, without any real understanding of infection or immune response. One day she was running through the courtyard, laughing at something her mother said, helping to prepare the evening meal. The next day she was warm to the touch, listless, refusing food. Jairus told himself it was nothing serious. Children fell ill and recovered all the time. The human body was resilient, especially the young body, and surely rest and broth and perhaps some herbs from the market would set things right. But the fever did not break. The girl who had been so full of life grew pale and still, her breathing shallow, her eyes losing their brightness. The physician who came, and Jairus, as a man of means, would have summoned the best physician available, could offer little beyond vague pronouncements and expensive treatments that accomplished nothing. Medicine in first-century Galilee was a haphazard affair of folk remedies and superstition, of incantations and amulets and concoctions that sometimes helped and often harmed. The physician bled her, perhaps, or applied poultices, or prescribed rest that she was already taking because she lacked the strength to do anything else. Nothing worked. Day by day, hour by hour, the synagogue ruler watched his only daughter slip further from his grasp. The household that had hummed with the ordinary rhythms of daily life, the grinding of grain, the chatter of servants, the negotiations of a busy family, fell into a kind of suspended dread. Jairus' wife moved through the rooms like a ghost, her face drawn, her prayers constant and increasingly desperate. Relatives gathered, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes filled with the terrible sympathy of those who have seen death come for the young before. The girl's room became the centre of the house, the place where everyone's attention focused even as they went about the motions of normalcy. Jairus found himself standing in doorways, watching his daughter sleep, if it could be called sleep, afraid to leave her side and equally afraid to stay, as though his presence might somehow ward off the darkness gathering at the edges of her life. He was a man accustomed to control, to the orderly administration of sacred duties, to problems that could be solved through wisdom and diligence. This was beyond his control. This was beyond anyone's control. His daughter was dying, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. It was in this state of helpless despair that word reached Jairus: Jesus had returned. The teacher had crossed back over the Sea of Galilee from the region of the Gerasenes, where rumours spoke of a madman delivered from a legion of demons, and a crowd was already gathering at the shore to meet him. Jairus had watched Jesus before, had listened to his teaching in the very synagogue Jairus administered, had witnessed healings that defied natural explanation. He had seen the paralytic walk. He had heard the authority in Jesus' voice when he spoke, an authority that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human learning or credential. The synagogue ruler had kept his distance, as befitted a man of his position. Many of his fellow religious leaders were suspicious of this Galilean preacher, this man who ate with tax collectors and touched lepers and claimed privileges that belonged only to God. To associate too closely with Jesus was to risk one's reputation, one's standing, perhaps even one's position. Jairus had been careful. Jairus had been prudent. Jairus had been wise in the ways that respectable men are wise. But wisdom means nothing when your daughter is dying in the next room. Something shifted in the synagogue ruler's heart as he heard that Jesus was near. Not a reasoned calculation, not a theological conclusion, but something more primal and desperate. Hope. It flickered to life in his chest like a flame-catching kindling, fragile and fierce at the same time. He had tried everything else. The physicians had failed. The prayers seemed to rise no higher than the ceiling. His money, his position, his connections, none of it could purchase another day of life for the girl lying pale and motionless on her bed. But this man, this Jesus, had healed others. The stories were everywhere. The lame walking, the blind seeing, fevers broken with a word, diseases fleeing at his touch. If Jesus could heal strangers, could he not heal the daughter of a synagogue ruler? If he had power over sickness, might he not use that power for a father's only child? Jairus made his decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He would go. He would find Jesus. He would beg if he had to, prostrate himself in the dust if that was what it took. Pride was a luxury for men whose children were healthy. Jairus could no longer afford it. He spoke briefly to his wife, saw the desperate hope kindle in her eyes to match his own, and then he was moving through the door, out into the streets of Capernaum, pushing past neighbours who called out greetings he did not hear, his sandals slapping against the packed earth as he made his way toward the waterfront. Every step felt urgent and impossibly slow. Every moment away from his daughter's bedside was a moment she might slip away forever. Yet he could not stay and do nothing. He could not watch her die without trying everything, without exhausting every possibility, without seeking out the one man in Galilee who might, just might, have the power to save her. The crowd was already thick by the time Jairus reached the shore, a press of bodies that seemed to have materialized from every corner of the region. Fishermen and farmers, merchants and beggars, the sick and the curious and the merely bored. They had all come to see Jesus, to hear him speak, to touch him if they could, to carry away some fragment of the power that seemed to radiate from his presence. Jairus pushed through them with an urgency that drew stares and muttered complaints. People did not push past the synagogue ruler. The synagogue ruler moved with dignity, with measured steps, with the gravity befitting his office. But dignity could not save his daughter. Gravity would not break her fever. Jairus shoved and shouldered his way through the mass of humanity, his heart pounding against his ribs, his eyes scanning desperately for the face he sought. And then he saw him. Jesus stood near the water's edge, surrounded by his disciples, his face calm amid the chaos of the crowd pressing in from every side. He was speaking to someone, Jairus could not hear what, but there was a stillness about him that seemed to create space even in the midst of the throng, a centered presence that drew the eye and held it. This was the man. This was the healer. This was the only hope a desperate father had left. Jairus did not hesitate. He did not calculate the cost to his reputation, or worry about what his fellow religious leaders might say when they heard. He pushed through the final barrier of bodies, broke into the open space around Jesus, and fell at his feet. The synagogue ruler of Capernaum, the respected elder, the man of standing and dignity, threw himself face down in the dirt before a carpenter's son from Nazareth. It was an act of total surrender, of complete humility, of faith stripped bare of everything except need. The Greek word the Gospel writers would use as prospipto described not a polite bow but full prostration, the posture of a subject before a king, of a beggar before a benefactor, of a man who has exhausted every other option and clings, now to the last thread of hope remaining. From the dust, Jairus lifted his voice. The words tumbled out raw and urgent, unpolished by the careful rhetoric he might have used in the synagogue, unguarded by the diplomatic caution that had served him well in his dealings with Roman officials and religious authorities. "My little daughter," he said, and even the diminutive he used, Thygatrian, revealed the tenderness that drove him, the desperate love of a father for his child. "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." He had heard that Jesus healed through touch. He believed, with the limited but genuine faith of a man grasping at what he had seen and heard, that if Jesus would only come, if he would only place his hands on the fevered forehead of a dying girl, something would change. Life would return. Death would retreat. His daughter would open her eyes and smile at him again. The crowd fell silent, watching. The disciples looked at their master waiting, and Jesus, the one they called Teacher, the one the demons called Holy One of God, the one who had stilled the storm on the sea and cast out legions of unclean spirits, looked down at the prostrate figure of the synagogue ruler and felt something move in his heart. He did not rebuke Jairus for his limited faith. He did not lecture him about proper theology or correct him for thinking that physical touch was necessary for healing. He did not remind the synagogue ruler that his colleagues had been hostile, that the religious establishment had questioned his authority, that coming to Jesus publicly might cost Jairus everything he had built. Jesus simply rose and began to walk toward Jairus' home. Hope, fragile and fierce, began to build in the father's chest as he scrambled to his feet and fell into step beside the teacher. The crowd pressed in around them, slowing their progress, but they were moving. They were going to his daughter. Jesus was coming. Jairus did not know, could not have known, that the journey ahead would test his flickering faith to its breaking point. He did not know that between the shore and his daughter's bedside, he would face an interruption that seemed designed to destroy him. He did not know that the worst news of his life was already speeding toward him, carried by messengers who even now were pushing through the streets of Capernaum with words that would shatter what remained of his hope. All Jairus knew in that moment was that Jesus had said yes, the teacher was coming, and as long as the healer walked beside him, as long as his daughter still drew breath, there was a chance. The father and the miracle worker moved through the crowd. and the clock that measured what remained of a young girl's life continued its relentless count. They had barely taken 10 steps before Jairus understood that the journey home would not be swift. The crowd that had parted, momentarily to let him reach Jesus now, closed around them like water, filling a depression in sand. Bodies pressing from every direction, hands reaching, voices calling out. These were not idle spectators content to watch from a distance. These were people who had travelled miles to be here, who had heard the stories and dared to believe them, who carried their own desperate hopes wrapped in the worn fabric of their cloaks. A man with a withered arm pushed forward, crying out for mercy. A woman clutching a fevered infant tried to work her way closer. An elderly beggar, blind from birth, called Jesus' name again and again, his voice cracking with decades of accumulated darkness. The crowd was a living thing, a creature of collective need, and it moved with its own terrible momentum. Jairus found himself wedged between a fisherman who smelled of the morning's catch and a merchant whose fine robes marked him as a man of means. Yet here they stood together, equals in their desperation to get closer to the Galilean healer. The synagogue ruler wanted to scream at them all, wanted to shout that his daughter was dying while they pressed and jostled and slowed their progress to a crawl. Did they not understand? Could they not see the urgency etched into every line of his face? But of course they could not. Each of them carried burdens invisible to the others. The woman with the infant believed her child's fever was the most pressing crisis in the world. The blind man had waited a lifetime for this moment. Every soul in that crowd had a story, a wound, a prayer they had carried to this shore, and none of them would willingly step aside to let someone else's emergency take precedence over their own. Jesus moved through them with a patience that made Jairus want to weep. The teacher did not push or hurry. He acknowledged those who called to him with a glance, a nod, sometimes a word that Jairus could not hear above the din. His disciples, Peter and James and John among them, tried to create a path, their broad shoulders useful for something beyond hauling nets, but even their efforts could clear only a narrow channel through the sea of humanity. Every step forward seemed to cost minutes that Jairus did not have. Every pause to acknowledge a supplicant felt like a small death, another grain of sand falling through the hourglass that measured his daughter's remaining breaths. The streets of Capernaum were not designed for crowds of this size. The town had grown organically over generations, houses built wherever space allowed, alleyways twisting between structures in patterns that made sense only to those who had walked them since childhood. Jairus knew these streets intimately. He had travelled them thousands of times on his way to the synagogue, to the market, to the homes of congregants who needed counsel or comfort. He knew the shortcuts, the wider passages, the routes that would bring them to his door most quickly. But knowing meant nothing when the crowd filled every available space, when the narrow lanes became choked with bodies, when forward movement slowed to something barely faster than standing still. He found himself walking beside Jesus, close enough to study the teacher's face in profile. What he saw there confounded him. There was no urgency in those features, no anxiety about the delay, no frustration with the crowd that impeded their progress. Jesus walked as though time itself moved at his command, as though the dying girl in the house ahead existed in a reality he could see, but Jairus could not. The synagogue ruler had spent his life reading faces. It was part of his role, discerning the needs of his congregation, identifying those who struggled beneath the surface of Sabbath propriety. But this face defied his interpretation. It held compassion, certainly, a deep and genuine concern for the suffering souls pressing in from every side. But it held something else too, something that looked almost like certainty, as though the outcome of this journey had already been written in a book Jairus could not read. The father's mind kept returning to the room he had left behind, to the bed where his daughter lay struggling for each breath, to his wife sitting vigil with red-rimmed eyes and prayers that had long since lost their words. What was happening there now? Had the girl's condition worsened in his absence? Was she calling for him, wondering why her father had abandoned her in her darkest hour? The thought pierced him like a blade between the ribs. He had left her to find help, but what if she died while he was gone? What if his last memory of her was not a tender goodbye but a hurried departure, a promise to return that he might not be able to keep? A commotion ahead broke through his spiralling thoughts. Someone had fainted in the heat, overcome by the press of bodies and the relentless Galilean sun. The crowd surged and shifted as people tried to help, creating a temporary eddy in the human current that brought their progress to a complete halt. Jairus watched Jesus turn toward the disturbance, watched his disciples move to assist, and felt something close to panic rising in his throat. Every delay was a knife. Every moment stolen was a moment his daughter might not have. He wanted to grab the teacher by the arm and drag him forward, propriety and reverence forgotten in the face of a father's terror. But he did not. Something held him back. Not merely respect for Jesus' authority, but something deeper, something he could not name. Perhaps it was the strange peace that seemed to emanate from the teacher even in the midst of chaos. Perhaps it was the memory of other stories he had heard, stories of Jesus calming storms with a word, of power that operated outside the normal constraints of time and space. Perhaps it was simply that Jairus had exhausted his capacity for action and could do nothing now but follow and trust and pray that trust would be enough. The crowd began to move again. The fallen person revived and supported by willing hands, the momentary obstruction cleared. They pressed forward through a narrow passage between two houses, emerged into a slightly wider street, turned a corner that Jairus recognized. They were perhaps halfway to his home now, halfway through a journey that should have taken minutes but had already consumed what felt like hours. The sun had shifted noticeably in the sky. Shadows fell at different angles than when they had started. Time, indifferent to human desperation, continued its measured march. Around them, the composition of the crowd shifted as they moved deeper into the town. Fewer curious strangers now, more familiar faces, neighbors who recognized Jairus and understood immediately why the synagogue ruler would be leading Jesus through the streets with such evident urgency. Word had spread, as word always did in small communities. People knew that Jairus' daughter was ill, had been ill for days, was now at the point of death. They stepped aside more readily, creating small clearings of space that allowed slightly faster progress, but they did not disperse. If anything, more joined the procession, drawn by the drama unfolding before them, by the chance to witness whatever would happen when the healer reached the dying girl's bedside. Jairus overheard fragments of conversation as they passed. "That's the synagogue ruler's daughter," someone said. "They say she won't last the day." Another voice, lower. "Do you think he can really—" The sentence trailed off, the speaker unwilling to complete the thought, unwilling to voice the hope or the doubt that warred within. These were Jairus' neighbours, his congregants, people who had sat in the synagogue and heard him read from the scrolls, who had brought their disputes to him for resolution, who had trusted his judgment on matters of religious practice. Now they watched him follow a controversial teacher through the streets, his dignity abandoned, his desperation visible to all. Whatever happened next, things would never be quite the same. The synagogue ruler had made his choice, had declared his allegiance, had staked his daughter's life on the power of a man who many of his colleagues considered dangerous. He thought of those colleagues now, the other synagogue leaders across Galilee, the Pharisees who had questioned Jesus' authority, the scribes from Jerusalem who had accused him of casting out demons by the power of demons. What would they say when they learned that Jairus had prostrated himself in the dust before this teacher? What whispered condemnations would circulate through the network of religious authorities? The synagogue ruler of Capernaum, grovelling at the feet of a man who broke Sabbath laws and ate with sinners. The shame of it would follow him for years, might even cost him his position, his standing, everything he had worked to build. And yet, walking beside Jesus through the crowded streets, Jairus found that he did not care. Let them whisper, let them condemn, let them strip him of every honour and title he possessed. None of it mattered if his daughter lived. He would trade every scrap of reputation, every achievement of his careful career, for the chance to see her smile again, to hear her laughter echoing through the courtyard, to watch her grow into the woman she was meant to become. Pride was a currency he had spent freely at the shore, and he discovered now that he had no desire to reclaim it. There was freedom in desperation, a strange liberty that came from having nothing left to protect except the thing that mattered most. The crowd surged again, and Jairus stumbled, caught himself, pressed forward. They were closer now, He could see the roofline of his own home rising above the houses ahead, could almost feel the presence of his daughter drawing him forward like a lodestone pulling iron. A few more streets, a few more turns, and they would arrive. Jesus would enter the house, would lay his hands on the fevered girl, would speak whatever word needed to be spoken. Life would return to those pale cheeks. Breath would flow freely again. The nightmare would end, and Jairus would fall to his knees once more, this time in gratitude rather than supplication. He allowed himself for just a moment to imagine the scene. His daughter sitting up in bed, confusion giving way to recognition, reaching for her father with arms that had hung limp for days. His wife weeping with joy instead of grief. The household erupting in celebration, in praise, in the kind of overwhelming relief that comes only after one has walked to the very edge of the abyss and been pulled back. It was possible. It was so close. Jesus was here, walking beside him, moving toward the house where death waited. Hope swelled in the synagogue ruler's chest until it pressed against his ribs, until it crowded out the fear that had lived there for days, until it became almost impossible to contain. They turned another corner, and the crowd thinned slightly. They had reached a residential area where the lanes were quieter, where fewer people had gathered. Jairus quickened his pace unconsciously, his feet carrying him forward faster than the press of bodies had allowed. His home was just ahead, perhaps 200 paces, close enough that he could distinguish individual stones in the wall, close enough that he could see the door through which he would lead the healer to his daughter's bedside. But Jesus had slowed. The teacher had stopped entirely, in fact, and was turning, looking back into the crowd with an expression Jairus had not seen before. Alert, searching, focused on something the synagogue ruler could not perceive. The disciples looked confused, exchanging glances, unsure why their master had halted when their destination was so near. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked, and his voice carried clearly in the momentary lull, a question that made no sense given the circumstances. Everyone had touched him. The crowd had pressed against him from every side for the entire journey. Hands had brushed his robes 100 times, shoulders had bumped against his, fingers had reached out hoping to grasp some fragment of the power he carried. The question was absurd, and Peter said as much, gesturing at the throng surrounding them, pointing out the obvious impossibility of identifying a single touch among so many. But Jesus was not satisfied. He continued to look, to search, his eyes moving through the crowd with an intensity that suggested he was seeing something invisible to everyone else. "Someone touched me," he said again. "I perceive that power has gone out from me." Jairus felt his heart stutter, felt the hope that had been building begin to crack at its foundations. They were so close. His house was right there, mere steps away, and Jesus had stopped for, what? A touch? A single contact among thousands? The synagogue ruler wanted to grab the teacher, to shake him, to cry out that there was no time for this, that every second they stood here was a second stolen from his daughter's dwindling supply. But he could not speak. His voice had fled, leaving him stranded in a silence filled with the pounding of his own pulse. And then, from somewhere behind them, a woman began to push forward through the crowd. A woman Jairus had not noticed before, her face pale with terror, her body trembling with something that might have been fear or exhaustion or both. She moved toward Jesus with the reluctant steps of one who wishes desperately to flee but cannot, one who has been seen and knows that hiding is no longer possible. The synagogue ruler did not know her story. He did not know that she had carried her own desperate hope to this shore, her own 12 years of suffering, her own prayers that had seemed to rise no higher than the ceiling. He knew only that she was an obstacle, another delay, another minute that his daughter might not survive. He did not know that he was about to learn the hardest lesson of faith, that sometimes heaven's timing looks like heaven's indifference, and that the God who sees a dying girl in Capernaum also sees a suffering woman in the crowd, and stops for both. Her name, like the name of Jairus' daughter, was never recorded. History would remember her only by her affliction, the woman with the issue of blood, the hemorrhaging woman, a title that reduced her entire existence to a medical condition she had never chosen and could not escape. But she had a name once spoken by parents who loved her, by friends who had long since drifted away, by a husband who may have divorced her when the bleeding would not stop and the law's demands became too heavy to bear. She had been someone before the illness defined her. She had been whole. 12 years. The number hung over her life like a sentence, like a curse, like the slow dripping of water that eventually wears through stone. 12 years. Since the bleeding had begun, since her body had betrayed her in a way that no physician could explain or remedy. 12 years of watching her savings disappear into the hands of healers who promised cures and delivered only disappointment. The Gospel of Mark would later record, with what reads almost like bitterness on her behalf, that she had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had and was no better but rather grew worse. The medical treatments of first-century Palestine were not gentle. They involved potions of dubious composition, procedures that caused as much harm as the conditions they purported to address, superstitions dressed up as science. The Talmud would later preserve some of the remedies prescribed for her condition, carrying the ashes of an ostrich egg in a linen bag, drinking wine mixed with powdered rubber, sitting at a crossroads holding a cup of wine while someone shouted startling words from behind. She had likely tried them all. She had certainly paid for them all, and the bleeding continued, month after month, year after year, until 12 of those years had accumulated behind her like a wall she could not climb. But the physical suffering, as relentless as it was, paled beside the social devastation the condition had wrought. The book of Leviticus was explicit on the matter. A woman with a discharge of blood beyond her normal period was unclean for as long as the discharge continued. Everything she sat on became unclean. Everyone who touched her became unclean until evening and had to wash their clothes and bathe in water. She was a walking contamination, a source of ritual impurity that spread to everything and everyone she contacted. In practical terms, this meant exile from the very fabric of community life. She could not enter the temple courts in Jerusalem. She could not participate in synagogue worship without defiling everyone around her. She could not share a meal with family or friends without rendering them unfit for religious observance. If she was married, her husband could not touch her, and the rabbis generally permitted divorce in cases where such conditions persisted. If she had children, she could not embrace them without passing her uncleanness to their small bodies. For 12 years, this woman had lived in a kind of social leprosy, not the visible decay of flesh that marked the true leper, but an invisible corruption that was in some ways even more isolating. At least lepers could gather with other lepers, could find community in their shared affliction. This woman's condition was intimate, shameful, the sort of thing spoken about in whispers if it was spoken about at all. She had likely lost her place in her family, her standing in her community, her sense of herself as a person worthy of touch and connection. For 12 years, she had not felt the casual brush of a hand on her shoulder, the embrace of a friend, the simple human contact that most people experience so often they forgot to notice it. She was untouchable in the most literal sense, a ghost moving through a world of the living, always present and always apart. And yet, she had come to the shore that morning, drawn by the same rumours that had drawn everyone else, the stories of a healer from Nazareth who touched lepers and made them clean, who did not recoil from the contaminated but reached toward them with hands that somehow purified rather than being defiled. She'd heard about the miracles, the blind receiving sight, the lame walking, fevers breaking at a word. Something had kindled in her chest, a dangerous thing she had learned to suppress over 12 years of disappointment: hope. If this Jesus could heal others, might he heal her? If his power was real, might it extend even to a condition that had resisted every other remedy? She had no intention of approaching him directly. Her condition made such an approach unthinkable. She could not push through a crowd without defiling everyone she touched, could not stand before a teacher and explain her shameful affliction in front of hundreds of witnesses. The very act of being in this crowd was a violation of the purity codes she had been taught to observe, a transgression that could have brought public rebuke if anyone had known what she carried hidden beneath her robes. But desperation had eroded her caution, and something else had begun to form in her mind, a plan born of faith mixed with fear. She would not ask for healing. She would not draw attention to herself. She would simply touch his garment, just the edge, just the fringe, the tzitzit that hung from the corners of his cloak as the law commanded. And perhaps, if the power was real, that would be enough. It was a theology of desperation, incomplete and perhaps superstitious, the kind of faith that grasps at whatever fragment of hope presents itself. She did not know if healing could flow through fabric. She did not know if power could be taken without permission. She knew only that she had nothing left to lose, that 12 years of suffering had brought her to this moment, and that if she did not try, she would spend the rest of her life wondering what might have happened if she had. So she followed the crowd as it moved through the streets of Capernaum, keeping to the edges, hiding her face, working her way closer to the teacher with each step. She saw the synagogue ruler fall at Jesus' feet, heard his desperate plea about a dying daughter, watched the procession begin its slow journey toward a house she did not know. The crowd pressed in from every side, jostling and pushing, and she used its chaos as cover, slipping between bodies, drawing nearer to her target. No one noticed her. No one ever noticed her anymore. Invisibility was one of the few gifts her condition had given her. The ability to pass through crowds unseen, a ghost among the living. She could see him now, just ahead, his back turned as he walked beside the desperate "Father!" The fringes of his garment swayed with each step, blue threads woven among white as the law prescribed, symbols of the commandments that set Israel apart from the nations. She was close enough to reach out and touch them. Her hand trembled at her side, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone around her must hear it. This was madness. This was hope. This was the last throw of dice by a woman who had nothing left to wager. She reached out. Her fingers brushed the fabric, barely a touch, the lightest possible contact between her skin and the hem of his robe. And in that instant, something happened that defied every expectation she had carried into this moment. She felt it. Not gradually, not subtly, but immediately and unmistakably. The flow of blood that had been her constant companion for 12 years stopped. The weakness that had drained her strength, the cramping that had doubled her over in private agony, the endless evidence of her body's betrayal, all of it ceased in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She was healed. She knew it with a certainty that went beyond physical sensation, a knowledge that seemed to have been planted directly in her soul. After 12 years of suffering, she was whole. For one breathless moment, she allowed herself to believe she had escaped notice. The crowd continued to move, the teacher continued to walk, and she was just another anonymous figure in the press of bodies, her secret healing tucked safely inside her restored body. She could slip away now, disappear into the streets of Capernaum, return to whatever remained of her life and begin again. No one needed to know. No one would ever know. But Jesus had stopped. The woman froze, her heart seizing in her chest, as the teacher turned and surveyed the crowd with eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to something deeper. "Who touched me?" he asked, and the question cut through the noise of the crowd like a blade through cloth. His disciples, Peter prominent among them, responded with incredulity. The crowd was pressing against him from every side. Dozens of people had touched him in the last few minutes alone. The question seemed absurd, impossible to answer, a distraction from the urgent mission that awaited them at the synagogue ruler's home. But Jesus was not asking about casual contact. He was asking about something else entirely, about faith that had reached out across the barrier of 12 years of suffering, about power that had flowed from him to meet that faith, about a healing that had occurred in secret but would not be allowed to remain hidden. "Someone touched me," he said again, "for I perceive that power has gone out from me." Jairus watched this exchange with mounting horror. His daughter was dying, perhaps had already died, and Jesus had stopped to investigate a touch. The synagogue ruler could see his home from where he stood, could almost feel the presence of his child in that upper room, fading with each breath, slipping away while the teacher delayed. He wanted to scream, to weep, to grab Jesus by the arm and drag him forward. What did it matter who had touched him? What did any of this matter when a 12-year-old girl lay on the threshold of death? But he could not speak. He could only watch as the woman, this stranger whose desperation had intersected his own, realized that concealment was no longer possible. She came forward trembling, falling at Jesus' feet just as Jairus had done at the shore, her whole body shaking with fear of what this exposure might cost her. She had touched a rabbi without permission. She had defiled him with her uncleanness, made him ritually impure through contact he had not consented to receive. The penalty for such presumption could be severe. Public rebuke at minimum, perhaps worse. She had stolen healing like a thief, and now she had been caught. The words poured out of her in a torrent. The whole truth, Mark's Gospel says, though what that truth contained we can only imagine. 12 years of suffering, physicians who took her money and left her worse than before, the isolation, the shame, the desperate hope that had driven her to reach for his garment, the healing that had flowed into her body the instant her fingers brushed the fabric. She held nothing back, confessing everything before Jesus and the crowd and the synagogue ruler whose own desperation burned beside her like a parallel flame. Jairus listened, and something shifted in his perception, even as his fear for his daughter continued to mount. 12 years. This woman had suffered for exactly as long as his daughter had been alive. The symmetry was too precise to be coincidental, too meaningful to ignore. 2 daughters, one who had never known health during the entire span of the other's existence, brought together at this moment, their stories intertwined by a providence that saw patterns invisible to human eyes. The synagogue ruler had come to Jesus for his child. This woman had come for herself. But they had come with the same desperation, the same fragile hope, the same willingness to risk everything on the chance that this teacher might be who people said he was. Jesus looked at the woman kneeling before him, and when he spoke, his voice carried a tenderness that transformed the moment from interrogation to restoration. "Daughter," he said, and that single word undid 12 years of isolation in an instant. Not woman, which would have been appropriate, not sinner, which some might have expected. Daughter. It was a term of endearment, of family connection, of belonging. This woman who had been cut off from community, excluded from the household of faith by a condition she could not control, was being publicly declared a member of God's family by the teacher everyone had gathered to see. She was not a thief who had stolen healing. She was a daughter who had reached out to her father and found him reaching back. "Daughter, your faith has made you well," Jesus continued. "Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." The Greek word he used, sesuken, meant more than physical healing. It was the word for salvation, for deliverance, for being made whole in every sense that mattered. Her body had been healed the moment she touched his garment. But something deeper was happening now. Her soul was being restored, her dignity reclaimed, her place in the community publicly validated by the only voice that ultimately mattered. She had come as a ghost, invisible and untouchable, and she was leaving as a daughter, seen and named and blessed. For the woman, this was the end of a nightmare that had lasted more than a decade. She rose from the dust transformed, tears streaming down her face, the weight of 12 years lifted from her shoulders in a single moment of grace. The crowd parted to let her pass, no longer a source of contamination, but a living testimony to the power that flowed through the Galilean healer. She would return to her home, if she still had one, and begin the long process of rebuilding a life that had been dismantled piece by piece over the years of her suffering. There would be practical matters to address: reconciliation with family members who had kept their distance, reintegration into a community that had learned to look through her, the recovery of relationships that illness had eroded. But those were problems for tomorrow. Today she was whole. Today she was a daughter. Today she had touched the hem of God's garment and found that he was not defiled by her contact, but rather that she was purified by his. But for Jairus, standing just steps from his own front door, the woman's healing was not an ending, but an agonizing delay. Every word Jesus spoke to her was a word not spoken to his daughter. Every moment of restoration was a moment his child did not have. The synagogue ruler had watched the entire exchange in a state of suspended terror, his hope cracking further with each passing second, his faith straining under a weight it had never been designed to bear. He understood, perhaps, why Jesus had stopped. He could see the compassion in the teacher's eyes, the genuine care for this woman who had suffered so long. But understanding did not ease the fear that clawed at his chest, did not silence the voice in his head that whispered his daughter was dying, might already be dead, while Jesus attended to someone else's crisis. And then, as if the universe had decided that Jairus had not yet been tested enough, figures appeared at the edge of the crowd. Familiar figures, servants from his own household, their faces grey with news they did not want to deliver. They pushed through the press of bodies with none of the urgency that had driven Jairus to the shore, their steps heavy with the weight of words that would shatter what remained of a father's hope. The woman's story had ended in joy. Jairus was about to discover that his story had taken a turn toward the darkest valley he had ever walked. Jairus recognized them before they spoke. 2 men from his household, servants who had been with his family for years, whose faces he had seen across countless meals and ordinary moments. They moved through the crowd with the particular heaviness of those bearing news they wished they did not carry, their eyes finding his across the press of bodies with an expression that needed no interpretation. The synagogue ruler felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. He knew. Before they opened their mouths, before a single syllable reached his ears, he knew what they had come to say. The taller of the 2 reached him first, placing a hand on Jairus' arm with the gentle pressure of condolence already being offered. "Your daughter is dead," he said, and the words fell into the air like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of devastation through everything they touched. Why trouble the teacher any further? There are moments in human experience when time seems to fracture, when the normal flow of seconds and minutes breaks apart and leaves only fragments, a face, a word, a sensation that burns itself into memory with permanent clarity. This was such a moment for Jairus. He heard the words, but they seemed to come from a great distance, as though he were underwater and someone was shouting at him from the surface. "Your daughter is dead!" The sentence contained only 4 words in English, fewer in the Aramaic the servants would have spoken, but each one carried the weight of a world collapsing. "Your," the possessive that reminded him she was his child, his only daughter, the girl he'd held in his arms when she was small enough to fit in the crook of his elbow. Daughter, the word that named her relationship to him, the bond that had defined his life for 12 years, the identity that had made him not just a synagogue ruler but a father, is dead. The brutal present tense that admitted no ambiguity, no hope of misunderstanding, no possibility that he had heard incorrectly. The second servant's words registered more slowly, filtering through the fog of grief that had descended over the synagogue ruler's mind. Why trouble the teacher any further? It was a reasonable question, spoken with the pragmatic kindness of men trying to spare their master additional pain. The girl was dead. Whatever power Jesus possessed, it had limits. Everyone knew that. Healers could cure the sick, could drive out fevers, could mend what was broken but still breathing. No one expected them to reverse death itself. The great prophets of old, Elijah, Elisha, had raised the dead on rare occasions, but those were exceptional miracles, singular events that punctuated centuries of ordinary mortality. To ask Jesus to come now would be to ask for something beyond the scope of any reasonable hope. Better to let the teacher continue his work among the living. Better to return home and begin the rituals of mourning. Better to accept what could not be changed. Jairus felt his knees begin to buckle, felt the strength drain from his legs as though someone had opened a valve and let it all flow out onto the packed earth beneath his feet. His daughter was dead. The girl he had left sleeping, if that shallow, laboured breathing could be called sleep, had slipped away while he was gone, while he was pushing through crowds and watching Jesus stop for a stranger, while hope had flickered and flared in his chest like a flame that meant nothing. She had died without him there. She had died while her father stood mere steps from their front door, close enough to see the roof line, close enough to have reached her if only the crowd had parted, if only the teacher had not stopped, if only time had moved differently than it did. The guilt crashed over him like a wave breaking against rocks. He should have stayed. He should have remained at her bedside, holding her hand, whispering words of love into her ear as she faded. What kind of father abandons his dying child to chase miracles through crowded streets? What kind of man leaves his daughter alone at the threshold of eternity while he prostrates himself before teachers and waits for healers who arrive too late? He had failed her in the most important moment of her short life. in the hour when she needed him most, he had not been there. The decision that had seemed so urgent at the shore, the desperate hope that had driven him to seek Jesus, now revealed itself as the worst choice he'd ever made. He had traded his daughter's final moments for a miracle that would never come. The crowd around them had fallen silent, the news rippling outward through the gathered bodies in whispers and murmurs. People stepped back, creating space around the grieving father as though his loss might be contagious, as though death could spread from his broken form to their still intact lives. The woman who had been healed was gone, lost somewhere in the streets of Capernaum, carrying her restoration to whatever home awaited her. The disciples stood in an awkward cluster, uncertain what to do, their eyes moving between their master and the devastated synagogue ruler. The mission had failed. They had come too late. There was nothing left to do but offer condolences and return to the shore. But Jesus had not moved. The teacher stood exactly where he had been when the servants arrived, his posture unchanged, his expression carrying something that Jairus could not immediately identify. It was not surprise. He showed no shock at the news, no visible reaction to the announcement that the girl they had been walking toward was no longer among the living. It was not resignation. There was nothing in his bearing that suggested acceptance of an unalterable outcome. If anything, Jesus looked expectant, as though the news the servants had delivered was not an ending but a beginning, not a closed door but one that was about to open onto something none of them had anticipated. "Do not fear," Jesus said, and his voice cut through the fog of Jairus' grief with an authority that demanded attention. "Only believe." The synagogue ruler looked up, his face wet with tears he did not remember shedding, his mind struggling to process words that made no sense in the context of what had just been announced. Do not fear? His daughter was dead. Only believe. Believe in what? The child was gone, her spirit departed, her small body lying cold in the house he could see from where he stood. What possible purpose could belief serve now? Faith was for the living, for situations where outcomes remained uncertain, where hope could attach itself to possibilities not yet foreclosed. Death was the great foreclosure, the final word that ended all sentences, the period that permitted no further punctuation. His daughter was dead, and no amount of believing would change that fundamental, devastating fact. But something in Jesus' eyes held Jairus in place, prevented him from turning away, from surrendering to the grief that pressed against his chest like a physical weight. The teacher was looking at him with an intensity that seemed to see past the tears, past the despair, past the reasonable conclusion that all hope had been extinguished. There was invitation in that gaze, and challenge, and something else, something that looked almost like a promise, though what could possibly be promised to a man whose child lay dead? The Greek verbs Jesus used in that moment carried nuances that the English translation struggles to convey. Mi phoba, stop fearing, a present imperative that acknowledged Jairus was already afraid and commanded him to cease. Pistou, keep believing, continue in faith, maintain the trust that had brought him to Jesus in the first place. The teacher was not asking for new faith, not demanding that Jairus summon belief from some untapped reserve he did not possess. He was asking the synagogue ruler to hold on to what he already had, to refuse to let go of the hope that had driven him to prostrate himself in the dust, even though circumstances now screamed that such hope was foolish. Do not let the fear swallow the faith. Do not let what you have just heard destroy what you chose to believe at the shore. It was an impossible request. Every reasonable instinct in Jairus' body urged him to collapse, to surrender, to accept the verdict that had been delivered and begin the long process of learning to live with loss. The servants were right. Why trouble the teacher any further? What could Jesus possibly do now that death had claimed its prize? The synagogue ruler had seen many deaths in his years of community leadership, had sat with grieving families, had recited the prayers for the departed, had watched the rituals of mourning unfold with their prescribed rhythms of grief and gradual acceptance. He knew how this story ended. He knew what came next. But he also remembered what he had seen in the synagogue, the authority in Jesus' voice when he spoke, the power that flowed from his presence, the demons that fled, and the diseases that broke at his command. He remembered the paralytic who had walked, the leper who had been cleansed. The stories that circulated through Galilee of a man who operated outside the normal constraints of what was possible. And he remembered something else, something older, buried deep in the scriptures he had spent his life studying. The story of Elijah and the widow's son, raised from death by the prophet's persistent prayer. The account of Elisha and the Shunammite's child, restored to life through the power of God working through human hands. The prophets of old had done such things. Rarely, yes, miraculously, certainly, but they had done them. Could this teacher do what the prophets had done? Could he reach across the barrier that separated the living from the dead and pull a 12-year-old girl back from whatever realm her spirit had entered? It seemed impossible. It seemed like madness to even consider. But Jairus had already abandoned dignity and reputation to seek Jesus' help. He had already prostrated himself in the dust before a man his colleagues despised. He had already staked everything on the desperate hope that this carpenter's son from Nazareth might be more than he appeared. What remained to lose by continuing to believe? Jesus began to move again, walking toward Jairus' home with the same measured pace he had maintained throughout the journey. But something had changed. He turned to his disciples and spoke quietly, selecting Peter and James and John to continue with him, while instructing the others to remain behind. The crowd too was left at the edge of the residential district, prevented from following further by some unspoken authority in the teacher's demeanour. What was about to happen would not be witnessed by curious multitudes or sceptical observers. It would occur in the intimate space of a grieving family's home, seen only by those Jesus chose to include. Jairus fell into step beside the teacher, his legs moving mechanically, his mind churning with a chaos of grief and doubt, and something that might have been hope, if hope could survive the announcement of death. The servants who had brought the news followed at a distance, uncertain what to make of this development. They had expected the synagogue ruler to return home with them, to begin the morning rituals, to accept what could not be changed. Instead, he was continuing toward the house, in the company of a teacher who spoke of belief in the face of death, as though the words the servants had delivered were not the end of the story, but merely an unexpected development in its middle chapters. The streets were quieter now, the crowd left behind, only the small group proceeding through the residential lanes toward the house where a dead girl waited. Jairus could hear sounds drifting from the direction of his home, wailing, the high-pitched keening of mourners, the discordant notes of flutes playing the melodies prescribed for grief. The rituals had already begun. His household had moved forward with the necessary observances, the tearing of garments and the extinguishing of lamps and the gathering of those who would sit with the family through the dark days ahead. In first-century Palestine, death did not wait for convenient timing. The body had to be prepared, the mourning commenced, the community mobilized to support the bereaved. Even the poorest family was required to hire at least 2 flute players and 1 professional wailing woman. A synagogue ruler's household would have many more. The sounds Jairus heard were the sounds of finality, of accepted loss, of a community moving through the prescribed stages of grief. But Jesus walked toward those sounds as though they were background noise rather than the announcement of an ending. His pace did not quicken with the urgency of someone rushing to confirm tragic news, nor did it slow with the reluctance of one approaching a scene of sorrow. He moved with purpose, with direction, with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was about to do and was simply covering the distance required to do it. Jairus watched the teacher's profile as they walked, searching for any sign of doubt or uncertainty, any indication that Jesus was reconsidering the implicit promise contained in his words at the street corner. He found none. Whatever Jesus believed about what awaited them at the house, that belief had not wavered in the face of the servant's announcement. Do not fear, only believe. The words echoed in the synagogue ruler's mind, competing with the sounds of mourning that grew louder with each step, competing with the grief that pressed against his chest, competing with the voice of reason that insisted hope was foolish and faith was futile in the face of death's accomplished fact. The door of his house came into view, and Jairus felt his steps falter. Beyond that door lay his daughter's body, cold and still, the face he loved drained of colour and life. Beyond that door lay his wife's devastated grief, the shattered hopes of their family, the empty future that stretched ahead without the girl who had filled their home with laughter and light. Beyond that door lay the hardest reality he had ever faced, the truth he had been running from since the servants spoke their terrible words. But beside him walked a man who had told him not to fear. Beside him moved a teacher who had spoken of belief in the present tense, as though it still mattered, as though faith could accomplish something even now. Jairus did not understand what was about to happen. He did not know if hope could survive the threshold he was about to cross. He knew only that he had come too far to turn back, had believed too much to stop believing now, had followed too long to abandon the journey at its darkest moment. The synagogue, ruler reached for the door of his own home and his hand trembled against the wood. Behind him, Jesus waited. Ahead of him, death had already claimed its victory. But perhaps, just perhaps, the story was not yet over. The door swung open, and grief poured out like water breaking through a dam. The sound hit Jairus before anything else, a wall of lamentation that seemed to press against his chest with physical force. The mingled voices of mourners raised in the ancient melodies of sorrow. Flutes wailed in discordant harmony, their notes designed not to soothe but to express the inexpressible, to give voice to the wound that death had opened in this household. Women keened in the traditional manner, their cries rising and falling in patterns passed down through generations, professional expressions of communal grief that transformed private loss into public ritual. The house that had been so quiet in the days of his daughter's illness, hushed with the suspended dread of waiting, now overflowed with noise, as though the silence of death required compensation, as though the stillness of a child's stopped heart demanded an answering cacophony from the living. Jairus stepped across the threshold into a scene that confirmed everything the servants had announced on the street. The rituals of mourning had commenced with the speed that the hot climate of Palestine demanded. Neighbours had gathered, filling the courtyard and spilling into the rooms beyond. Some sat on the ground in the posture of grief, their garments torn at the collar in the prescribed manner, dust scattered on their heads as a sign of devastation. Others moved through the space with purposeful sorrow, arranging the elements of the mourning period, ensuring that the family would be supported through the days of sitting Shiva that lay ahead. The air smelled of extinguished lamps, oil wicks snuffed out as a symbol of the light that had departed from this home, and beneath that the faint, sweet scent of the spices that would soon be needed for burial. His wife appeared from an inner room, her face swollen with weeping, her eyes carrying the hollow look of a mother who had watched her only child slip away. She moved toward Jairus with uncertain steps, and when she reached him, she collapsed against his chest with a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a scream, but something between, something that emerged from a depth of grief that words could not reach. He held her, his arms wrapping around her shaking form, and for a long moment the two of them stood locked together in the wreckage of their shared hopes. Two parents united in the worst loss parents can face. She had been there when it happened. The words came out between gasps, between the convulsions of grief that shook her body. She had been sitting beside the bed, holding their daughter's hand, watching the shallow rise and fall of that small chest become slower and slower, the intervals between breath stretching longer and longer until finally there was no next breath, until the chest simply stopped rising, until the hand in hers grew still and the battle was over. The girl had not woken at the end. She had not spoken any final words, had not opened her eyes to see her mother's face one last time. She had simply faded, like a lamp running out of oil, like a fire surrendering its last ember to ash. And then she was gone, and the mother who had carried her for 9 months and nursed her through infancy and watched her grow into a beautiful 12-year-old girl was left holding a hand that would never squeeze back. Jairus listened to his wife's account with a devastation that cut deeper than the servant's announcement had reached. He had known his daughter was dead. The words had been spoken clearly enough, but hearing the details, imagining those final moments he'd missed, understanding that his child had crossed into eternity, while he stood in a crowded street watching Jesus speak to a stranger, added new dimensions to his grief. He should have been there. The thought circled in his mind like a vulture over carrion, returning again and again to feed on his guilt. He should have been holding that hand. He should have been whispering words of love into those ears. He should have been the last face his daughter saw before her eyes closed forever. Instead, he had been chasing miracles, and the miracle had not come, and now his daughter lay dead in a room he had not yet found the courage to enter. The mourners had noticed the arrival of strangers, the 3 men who had entered behind Jairus, their presence incongruous amid the rituals of grief. Peter, James, and John stood near the doorway, their faces uncertain, their bodies tense with the awkwardness of those who have intruded upon private sorrow. The crowd's attention shifted toward them, toward the figure they flanked, toward the teacher who had entered a house of death, as though he had business there that the mourning assembly could not yet comprehend. Jesus surveyed the scene with eyes that missed nothing. The professional mourners with their practiced wailing, the flute players whose melodies filled every silence, the neighbours who had gathered to support the family through prescribed rituals of loss. The commotion swirled around him, the sounds of grief pressing from every direction, but he stood in the midst of it with the same centered stillness he had maintained throughout the journey from the shore. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the noise, cutting through the wailing and the flutes and the murmured condolences with an authority that demanded attention. "Why do you make this commotion and weep?" he asked, and the question itself seemed strange, almost inappropriate, in the context of what had occurred. A child was dead. The household was in mourning. The commotion and weeping were exactly what the situation required, exactly what religious custom prescribed, exactly what any reasonable observer would expect to find in a home where death had visited. To question the mourning was to question the reality of the loss itself, to suggest that something was amiss in the community's response to tragedy. But Jesus was not finished. "The child is not dead," he said, "but sleeping." The words fell into the crowded room like stones dropped into still water, their impact rippling outward through the assembled mourners. For a moment there was silence. The flutes paused, the wailing halted, the entire house seeming to hold its breath as people processed what they had just heard. Not dead, sleeping. The teacher from Nazareth, the healer about whom so many stories circulated, had just contradicted the obvious reality that everyone present had witnessed or accepted. The girl was dead. Her mother had watched her die. The body had been examined, the death confirmed, the mourning rituals initiated according to ancient custom. How could this man stand in the midst of their grief and declare that the child was merely sleeping? The laughter began as a few scattered sounds, nervous reactions to a statement too absurd to take seriously, but it quickly grew into something more sustained and mocking. Katagelau, the Gospel of Mark would record, they laughed him to scorn, and the verb's imperfect tense indicated continuous action, wave after wave of ridicule washing over the teacher who had made such an impossible claim. These were not cruel people, not enemies seeking to humiliate Jesus. They were simply practical individuals confronted with a statement that contradicted everything their eyes had seen and their experience had taught them. The girl was dead. They knew death when they saw it. Whatever power this teacher possessed, whatever miracles he had performed elsewhere, he had arrived too late in this case, and his assertion to the contrary was either delusion or folly. Jairus watched the scene unfold with a heart divided against itself. Part of him wanted to join the laughter, to release the tension of his grief in the bitter acknowledgement that hope had been foolish all along. His daughter was dead. He had seen death before, had presided over funerals as part of his synagogue duties, had sat with enough grieving families to recognize the finality that now filled his home. The teacher's words were absurd, a denial of reality that no amount of faith could transform into truth. The synagogue ruler knew this. His reason shouted it at him with the full force of accumulated experience. But another part of him remembered the words Jesus had spoken on the street, the command that had held him upright when the servants delivered their devastating news. Do not fear, only believe. He had chosen to follow the teacher past the point where following made sense, past the announcement of death, past the threshold of his own grief-filled home. If he abandoned belief now, what had that journey meant? If he surrendered to the mockery of the mourners, what had his prostration in the dust accomplished? Jesus had known the girl was dead when he spoke those words. The servants had announced it clearly enough within earshot of everyone present, and yet he had continued walking, had continued speaking of faith as though it still mattered. Either the teacher was mad or he knew something the mourners did not. Jesus showed no reaction to the laughter, no offence at the ridicule being directed toward him. His expression remained calm, resolute, carrying the same quiet authority it had displayed throughout this long afternoon. He turned to the mourners and the flute players and the neighbours who had gathered to support the bereaved family, and he put them out. The Greek phrase Mark used, ekbalon, was the same word employed for casting out demons, a forceful term that suggested not polite requests, but decisive action. Jesus expelled the mourners from the house, clearing the space of their skepticism and their laughter, removing the audience that had come to witness grief and found themselves confronted with something their frameworks could not accommodate. The professional wailers departed, their employment abruptly terminated by an authority they could not refuse. The flute players gathered their instruments and withdrew, their melodies of sorrow silenced mid-phrase. The neighbours who had come to support the family found themselves ushered toward the door, their condolences unfinished, their ritual roles unexpectedly suspended. Within minutes, the house that had been filled with the sounds of mourning fell into a strange expectant silence. The commotion was over. The weeping had ceased. What remained was a space cleared of everything except the small group Jesus had chosen to retain. He kept only 5 people: Peter, James, and John, the 3 disciples who formed his inner circle, the witnesses he was training for moments of supreme revelation, and the girl's parents, the father who had sought him at the shore, and the mother who had watched her daughter's final breath. These 5, and no others, would be permitted to witness what was about to unfold. Whatever Jesus intended to do, he would do it away from the eyes of skeptics and mockers, in the presence of those who had capacity to believe, or at least the willingness to try. Jairus felt his wife's hand slip into his, her fingers intertwining with his own, gripping with a pressure that communicated everything words could not convey. She did not understand what was happening any more than he did. She had watched their daughter die, had felt the life depart from that small body, had initiated the rituals of mourning because the rituals were what you did when death arrived. And now this teacher had dismissed the mourners and spoken of sleep instead of death, and was leading them toward the room where their child's body waited. Hope and terror battled in her eyes, the fear of disappointment warring with the desperate wish that somehow, impossibly, this might not be the end. Together, the small group moved through the house toward the inner room where the girl had been laid. The silence that had replaced the morning commotion was profound, weighted with anticipation that pressed against the walls. Their footsteps sounded unnaturally loud on the stone floor, each step carrying them closer to a confrontation with death that seemed both inevitable and somehow uncertain. Peter, James, and John followed behind the parents, their faces solemn, their eyes alert to everything occurring around them. They had seen Jesus perform miracles before, healings and deliverances and demonstrations of power that had left them breathless with wonder, but they had never seen him confront death itself, never watched him approach a body from which life had already departed, never witnessed what happened when the authority that commanded demons met the enemy that claimed every human eventually. The door to the girl's room stood before them, closed against whatever lay within. Jairus realized he had not entered this room since leaving to seek Jesus at the shore, had not seen his daughter in the final stage of her illness, had not witnessed her last moments, had not looked upon her face since death had claimed its victory. Behind this door lay the reality he had been dreading since the servants spoke their terrible words, the confirmation of loss that he had managed to hold at a distance through the strange events of the past hour. Behind this door lay his child, his only daughter, the girl he'd held in his arms when she was newly born and perfect, the laughter that had filled his courtyard, the future that would never arrive. His hand reached for the door and he found that he was trembling. Not from cold, the afternoon was warm, the interior of the house warmer still, but from the accumulated weight of everything this moment contained. Fear and hope and grief, and the impossible words of a teacher who spoke of sleep instead of death. His wife pressed closer to his side, drawing strength from his presence even as he drew strength from hers. Whatever waited beyond this door, they would face it together. Whatever happened next, they would witness it as parents, united in their love for the child who lay within. Jesus stepped forward, his presence somehow both gentle and commanding, and placed his hand on the door beside Jairus' trembling fingers. "Do not be afraid," he said again, and this time the words were quiet, intimate, meant only for the parents who stood on the threshold of their deepest grief. "Only believe." The door swung open, and the room beyond came into view, dim with the extinguished lamps, still with the particular stillness of a space where life had recently departed. And there, on the bed where she had fought her final battle against the illness that had claimed her, lay the daughter of Jairus, 12 years old, pale and motionless, her hands folded across her, chest in the posture the women had arranged after death took her, her face carrying the strange peace that sometimes settles on the features of those who have stopped struggling. Jairus heard his wife gasp, felt her body shudder against his, understood that seeing their daughter like this, so still, so pale, so unmistakably dead, had made the loss real in a way that even the servant's announcement had not accomplished. This was not a child sleeping. This was a child who had crossed the boundary that separated the living from the dead, whose spirit had departed for whatever realm awaited beyond this life, whose body remained only as a shell waiting for burial. But Jesus was already moving into the room, approaching the bed with steps that carried no hesitation, no doubt, no uncertainty about what he intended to do. The disciples and the parents remained near the doorway, watching, barely breathing, the tension in the small space building towards something none of them could name or anticipate. The teacher who had dismissed the mourners, who had spoken of sleep instead of death, who had commanded belief in the face of impossibility, now stood beside the lifeless form of a 12-year-old girl, looking down at her with an expression that held neither grief nor resignation, but something else entirely. Something that looked almost like tenderness, like the love of a father for a child, like the anticipation of reunion after a brief separation. The room grew still. The afternoon light filtering through the small window seemed to hold its breath, and Jairus, standing at the threshold of the impossible, found that his hands had stopped trembling, not because he had ceased to fear, but because fear and faith had reached a point of perfect balance, each cancelling the other, leaving only a profound stillness in which anything might happen. Jesus reached down and took the girl's hand in his own. The touch itself was a transgression. According to the law of Moses, codified in the Book of Numbers, anyone who touched a dead body became ceremonially unclean for 7 days. The contamination was severe, requiring elaborate rituals of purification, water mixed with the ashes of a red heifer, applied on the 3rd and 7th days, with washing of clothes and bathing before the person could rejoin the community of the clean. To touch a corpse was to enter a state of ritual defilement that separated one from the assembly of Israel, from participation in worship, from the normal commerce of daily religious life. The priests and Levites were especially warned against such contact. The high priest was forbidden to approach even the bodies of his own parents lest he defile himself. Death was the great contaminator, and its touch spread through physical contact like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Jesus took the dead girl's hand anyway. Jairus watched the teacher's fingers wrap around those small still fingers, the hand that had gripped his own so many times, reaching up for her father when she was learning to walk, slipping into his palm as they crossed busy streets, waving goodbye as he left for the synagogue on Sabbath mornings. That hand had been warm once, animated by the life that flowed through her small body, expressive of every emotion a child could feel. Now it lay cold and motionless, and a rabbi from Nazareth had chosen to touch it, to make contact with death itself, to bridge with his living flesh the gap between the breathing and the departed. But something was different here, something that inverted the normal logic of contamination and purity. When Jesus had touched the leper in the early days of his ministry, the expected defilement had not occurred. Instead of the leper's uncleanness spreading to Jesus, Jesus' wholeness had spread to the leper. The man's skin had been restored, his disease cleansed, the contamination that had isolated him from community transformed into health by contact with the teacher's hand. When the woman with the issue of blood had touched Jesus' garment just hours earlier, she had not rendered him unclean. Rather, His power had flowed into her brokenness and made her whole. The normal direction of influence, from impure to pure, from sick to healthy, from dead to living, seemed to reverse in Jesus' presence. Contamination could not contaminate him. Instead, his purity contaminated it. The room held its breath. Peter, James, and John stood motionless near the doorway, their eyes fixed on the scene before them, their minds struggling to process what they were witnessing. They had seen miracles, many miracles in the months they had travelled with this teacher, but they had never seen anything like this. The healings they had witnessed had all involved the living, people who still breathed and moved and responded to stimulus. This was different. This was a confrontation with death itself, with the enemy that claimed every human eventually, with the boundary that no prophet had crossed more than a handful of times in all the centuries of Israel's history. Elijah had raised the widow's son at Zarephath. Elisha had restored the Shunammite's child. But those miracles were ancient, exceptional, separated by generations of ordinary mortality. What was happening in this room, if anything was happening at all, would place Jesus in a category occupied by only the greatest of Israel's prophets, and perhaps beyond even them. Jairus felt his wife's grip tighten on his arm, her fingernails pressing into his flesh with an intensity that would leave marks. Her breathing had become shallow, rapid, the respiration of someone suspended between terror and hope, with no solid ground beneath either emotion. They had buried dreams in this room. They had surrendered their daughter to the silence that follows the final breath. They had begun the long process of accepting that their family would never be whole again, that the future they had imagined, grandchildren, weddings, the ordinary continuations of generational life, had been amputated by an illness no physician could cure. And now they stood watching a stranger hold their dead child's hand, speaking words they did not understand, doing something that made no sense in any framework they possessed for making sense of the world. Jesus leaned closer to the girl, his face drawing near to hers, his posture suggesting intimacy rather than ritual, relationship rather than performance. When he spoke, the words came in Aramaic, the common tongue of Galilee, the language this girl would have heard from her first moments of consciousness, the speech of lullabies and family meals and bedtime stories. Mark's Gospel would preserve these words in their original form, one of the few instances where the actual syllables Jesus spoke were retained rather than translated into Greek for the wider audience of the early church. There was something important in these words, something that the evangelist wanted his readers to hear exactly as they had been spoken, without the filtering effect of translation. Talitha cum, 2 words. In English, they would be rendered, "Little girl, arise," or "Little lamb, get up." But the translation could not capture everything the Aramaic conveyed. Talitha was a term of endearment, a diminutive that parents used with young daughters, a word that carried warmth and affection, and the particular tenderness that adults reserve for children. It was not the formal address a teacher might use to a stranger's child, not the distant language of a healer performing a procedure. It was the intimate vocabulary of family, the way a father might wake a sleeping daughter on a Sabbath morning, gently calling her back from dreams to the waking world. Cum was simply the imperative: arise, get up, wake. But spoken in this context, to this child, by this voice, it became something more than a command. It became an invitation, a summons, a calling forth from wherever the girl's spirit had gone in the hours since her breathing stopped. The prophets who had raised the dead had done so differently. Elijah had stretched himself upon the widow's son 3 times, crying out to the Lord, asking God to let the child's soul return to his body. The miracle had come through intercession, through persistent prayer, through the prophet serving as a conduit for divine power that originated elsewhere. Elisha had followed a similar pattern, lying upon the Shunammite's son, placing mouth to mouth and eyes to eyes and hands to hands, praying until warmth returned to the child's flesh. These were mediated miracles, power flowing through human vessels from a divine source beyond them. The prophets had been instruments, God had been the musician. But Jesus spoke with no prayer, no intercession, no appeal to a higher authority. He spoke as though the authority resided in himself, as though the power to call the dead back to life was his own too. Exercise as though death itself was obligated to obey his voice. Talitha cum. Not Lord, restore this child, or God of Israel, return her spirit to her body. Simply an address to the girl herself, followed by a command to rise, as though death were merely sleep, as he had told the mourners, and waking from it required nothing more than someone with the authority to speak the waking word. For one eternal moment, nothing happened. The girl lay still on the bed, her hand limp in Jesus' grasp, her chest unmoving, her face carrying the same pale peace it had worn when they entered the room. Jairus felt something inside him beginning to crack, the fragile structure of hope that had carried him through the past hour threatening to collapse entirely. He had believed. He had followed. He had brought the teacher into the room where his daughter's body waited. And now, the girl's fingers twitched. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, the slightest contraction of muscles that had been still for hours. Jairus might have imagined it, might have projected hope onto a corpse that remained as lifeless as before. But then it happened again, a definite motion, the girl's hand responding to the warmth of Jesus' grip, her fingers curling slightly around his, and then she breathed. The sound was soft at first, a whisper of air entering lungs that had been empty, the first inflation of a chest that had lain motionless. But it was unmistakable, the gentle rise and fall of respiration, the rhythm of a life asserting itself against the silence of death. Colour began to return to her face, the waxy pallor of the corpse giving way to the warm flush of blood flowing through living tissue. Her eyelids fluttered, trembled, and then slowly opened, revealing eyes that focused with increasing clarity on the face of the man who still held her hand. Jairus heard a sound beside him and realized it was his wife, a gasp that became a sob that became something no word could adequately describe, the vocalization of a mother watching her child return from a place no one was supposed to return from. The synagogue ruler's own response came a moment later, a cry that tore from his throat without his permission, grief and joy so intermingled that they became a single overwhelming emotion that demanded release. His daughter was alive. His daughter was looking around the room. His daughter was sitting up on the bed where her body had lain, in the stillness of death. The Gospel of Mark would record that she arose immediately and walked, and the adverb, euthys, straightway at once, emphasized the completeness of her restoration. This was not a gradual recovery, not a slow return of strength to wasted limbs. The girl who had been too weak to lift her head during her illness, who had faded day by day until life itself departed, now moved with the full vigour of health. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, and there was no wobbling, no uncertainty, no lingering trace of the sickness that had claimed her. She was not merely alive, she was whole, restored, every faculty and function operating as though the illness and the death that followed had never occurred. Jairus moved without conscious thought, crossing the space between the doorway and his daughter in a few quick strides, falling to his knees before her, wrapping his arms around her small form with a fierceness that threatened to crush them both. She was warm. She was breathing. Her heart beat against his chest in the steady rhythm of life, and her arms came up to encircle his neck with the familiar gesture of a child embracing her father. He wept into her hair, great shuddering sobs that released days of fear and hours of grief, and the accumulated weight of a journey that had taken him from desperation to devastation, to this impossible, overwhelming, miraculous moment. His wife joined them seconds later, her arms encompassing both her husband and her daughter, the three of them locked together in an embrace that contained everything words could not express. The mother who had watched her child die now felt that child's breath against her neck, heard her daughter's voice asking confused questions about why everyone was crying, touched the warm flesh that had been cold, the moving limbs that had been still. Whatever explanations would eventually be required, whatever understanding would need to be reached about what had just happened, could wait. For this moment, there was only the impossible made actual, the dead restored to life, the family that had been broken made whole again. Peter, James, and John stood at the doorway, their faces bearing expressions that mixed awe with something approaching fear. They had witnessed many things in their months with Jesus, healings that defied medical explanation, deliverances that routed demonic powers, a storm calmed by a word spoken over chaotic waters. But this was different. This was not power over sickness or spirits or nature. This was power over death itself, the enemy that had haunted humanity since Eden, the curse that no prophet or king had ever been able to finally defeat. The man they followed, the teacher they had left their nets to accompany, had just spoken 2 words in Aramaic and recalled a dead girl to life. Whatever they had thought they knew about Jesus, whatever categories they had used to understand his identity and his mission, had just been shattered and would need to be rebuilt around this new, staggering reality. Jesus stood beside the bed, watching the reunion of parents and child with an expression that held deep satisfaction and something that might have been joy. He had not performed this miracle for an audience, had not gathered crowds to witness his power over death, had not used this moment to make proclamations about his identity or his authority. He had done it quietly, intimately, in a room with only 5 witnesses for the sake of a 12-year-old girl and the parents, who loved her. The God who counted the hairs on every head, who noted the fall of every sparrow, who saw the individual amid the multitude, had stopped for one life, had crossed the boundary of death for one child, in one house, in one unremarkable town on the shore of Galilee. When Jesus spoke again, his words were startlingly practical. "Give her something to eat," he said, and the instruction cut through the overwhelming emotion of the moment with its simple concern for ordinary needs. The girl had been ill for days, had taken little nourishment, had crossed through death itself and returned. Her body needed food. Her stomach, now functioning again in a frame that was fully alive, required the sustenance that would restore her strength and confirm the physical reality of her resurrection. It was such a human concern, so grounded in the practical necessities of embodied existence, that it almost seemed anticlimactic after the cosmic drama that had just unfolded. But it was also deeply revealing, a reminder that Jesus cared not only about spiritual restoration, but about physical needs, not only about miracles, but about meals, not only about the grand gesture that defeated death, but about the small kindness that provided bread. The instruction served another purpose as well, though those present might not have recognized it immediately. Ghosts did not eat. Spirits did not require food. If the girl had returned as some kind of apparition, some shadowy echo of her former self, she would have no need for the bread and fish that made up ordinary Galilean fare. By commanding that she be fed, Jesus was confirming the bodily nature of her resurrection. This was not a vision or a spiritual manifestation. This was a 12-year-old girl, hungry after her ordeal, needing the same nourishment she'd always needed. The resurrection was physical, tangible, complete. Not a rescue of the soul alone, but a restoration of the whole person, body and spirit reunited in the fullness of life. Jairus' wife moved to comply, her practical instincts reasserting themselves even as tears continued to stream down her face. She would find food for her daughter. She would prepare a meal, set it before the child she had thought she would never feed again, watch her eat with the appetite of health restored. These ordinary actions, the preparing and the serving and the eating, would become their own form of worship, their own acknowledgement of the miracle that had visited their home. The rituals of mourning that had begun just hours earlier would give way to rituals of celebration, the torn garments replaced by festive clothing, the extinguished lamps relit to illuminate a house transformed by joy. But before the celebration could begin, Jesus issued one more instruction, one that puzzled those who heard it and has puzzled readers of the Gospel ever since. He strictly charged them that no one should know this, Mark recorded, using language that emphasized the seriousness of the command. The miracle that had just occurred, the raising of a dead girl to life, was not to be broadcast. The witnesses were not to spread the story through Capernaum and beyond. What had happened in this room was to remain, as much as possible, a private matter. It was, of course, an impossible command to fully obey. The mourners who had been expelled from the house knew that a dead girl lay within. They would see that same girl walking and eating and living in the days that followed. The servants who had brought news of her death would witness her resurrection. The community that had begun to grieve would be forced to reckon with the inexplicable reversal of that grief. Word would spread. as word always did in small towns where everyone knew everyone else's business. But Jesus' instruction revealed something about his priorities, about the way he understood his mission and the timing that governed its unfolding. He had not come to be known primarily as a wonder worker, a miracle man whose power over death would draw crowds seeking spectacular displays. He had not come to build a reputation on signs and wonders that would attract the wrong kind of following. People interested in what he could do rather than who he was, in the benefits he could provide rather than the kingdom he proclaimed. The miracle in Jairus' house was an act of compassion, not a publicity campaign. It was done for the sake of a suffering family, not for the sake of gathering disciples or impressing skeptics. Jesus wanted the focus to remain where it belonged, on the message of the kingdom, on the call to repentance and faith, on the relationship with God that his ministry was opening to all who would receive it. The afternoon light had shifted in the small room, the shadows lengthening as the day moved toward evening. The crisis that had begun at the shore, that had wound through crowded streets and an agonizing interruption, and the worst news a father could receive, had reached its resolution in a way no one could have predicted. A girl who had been dead was now alive. A family that had been shattered was now whole. A synagogue ruler who had risked everything to seek help from a controversial teacher had received more than he had dared to ask for. Not merely healing, but resurrection. Not merely recovery, but return from the realm of the dead. Jairus looked at Jesus with eyes that could not contain everything he felt. Gratitude too deep for words, awe that bordered on terror, love for a man who had given him back his daughter, questions that would take a lifetime to fully explore. Who was this teacher from Nazareth? What power did he possess that death itself obeyed his voice? What did it mean that such a one walked the roads of Galilee, entered the homes of ordinary families, stopped for the desperate pleas of synagogue rulers and the secret touches of suffering women? The questions would remain, for now, unanswered. But the girl was alive, standing, in the middle of the room, looking around at the adults whose tears she did not fully understand, asking for the food that Jesus had commanded be given to her. And that was enough. For this moment in this house, in this small town by the lake, that was more than enough. Death had come for the daughter of Jairus, and death had been turned away at the door. The sun was setting over the Sea of Galilee by the time Jesus and his disciples departed from Jairus' home, the western sky painted in shades of amber and rose that reflected off the water in the distance. The teacher who had spoken 2 Aramaic words and recalled a dead girl to life walked back through the streets of Capernaum with the same unhurried pace he had maintained throughout the day, as though raising the dead was simply another expression of the work he had come to do. Remarkable, certainly, but not outside the scope of his mission. The disciples followed in contemplative silence, their minds still processing what they had witnessed in that small room, their understanding of their master deepened and complicated by a demonstration of power that exceeded anything they had previously imagined. Behind them, in a house that had been transformed from a place of mourning to a place of celebration, a family was beginning the slow process of returning to ordinary life. There would be explanations to give, to the mourners who had been expelled, to the neighbours who had gathered to grieve, to the extended family who would arrive expecting to sit shiva and find instead a living girl eating bread in the courtyard. There would be questions that could not be fully answered, whispers that would circulate through Capernaum despite Jesus' instruction to silence. A story that would grow and spread because stories of the dead returning to life cannot be contained by commands to discretion. But for now, in the golden light of evening, none of that mattered. What mattered was the girl sitting at the table, the mother preparing food with hands that trembled with joy rather than grief, the father watching his daughter with eyes that could not look away, afraid that if he blinked she might disappear again into the realm from which she had been summoned. Jairus would never be the same man he had been that morning. The synagogue ruler who had administered Sabbath services with dignified competence, who had maintained careful distance from controversial teachers, who had navigated the political complexities of religious leadership with prudent wisdom, had been broken open by desperation and remade by miracle. He had prostrated himself in the dust before a carpenter's son. He had followed when following made no sense. He had believed when belief seemed like madness. And he had received his daughter back from death itself. a gift so far beyond anything he had dared to request that it would take years to fully comprehend what had happened in his home on this impossible afternoon. What would become of him in the days and months that followed? The Gospels do not say. Jairus disappears from the biblical narrative after this single, shattering appearance, his subsequent life left to imagination and inference. Did he continue as synagogue ruler, administering services to a congregation that knew what had happened in his home? Did his colleagues among the religious leadership accept or reject him after his public association with Jesus? Did he become a follower of the teacher, joining the growing movement that would eventually transform the Roman Empire? Or did he return to his previous life, carrying the memory of miracle like a secret treasure hidden in the ordinary routines of religious respectability? We cannot know for certain, but we can observe what the story reveals about the kind of God Jesus represented, the kind of kingdom he proclaimed, the kind of salvation he offered to those who came to him in desperate faith. The miracle in Capernaum was not performed for a crowd. It was not designed to generate publicity or prove a theological point to skeptics. It was an act of intimate compassion, power exercised for the sake of one family, one father, one 12-year-old girl whose name was never recorded but whose life was precious enough to stop heaven's steps. This was the pattern that characterized Jesus' ministry from beginning to end. The particular amid the universal, the individual within the multitude, the single soul that mattered as much as the masses. He taught crowds that numbered in the thousands, but he stopped for a woman who touched his garment in secret. He proclaimed a kingdom that would encompass all nations, but he took the time to bless children whom the disciples tried to turn away. He spoke of cosmic realities, the judgment of the world, the coming of the Son of Man, the ultimate defeat of evil. But he noticed when a poor widow dropped 2 small coins into the temple treasury and commended her gift above all the wealthy donors. The God revealed in Jesus was not a deity of abstractions and generalities, but a father who knew the number of hairs on each head, who saw the sparrow fall, who heard the cry of one desperate father in the chaos of a crowded shore. The story of Jairus' daughter cannot be separated from the story that interrupted it. The account of the woman who had suffered for 12 years with an issue of blood, who had spent everything she had on physicians who could not help her, who had reached out in secret faith and found herself healed and named as a daughter by the teacher she had hoped to touch unnoticed. These 2 narratives are woven together in the Gospel accounts not by accident but by design, each illuminating the other, the connections between them revealing truths that neither story alone could fully express. Consider the numbers that bind them. 12 years of suffering for the woman, 12 years of life for the girl. The hemorrhaging had begun at the same time the child was born, as though some cosmic ledger had opened 2 accounts simultaneously, recording parallel journeys of struggle and growth that would converge on this single afternoon in Capernaum. The woman had never known health during the entire span of the girl's existence. The girl had never known a world in which this woman was not suffering somewhere, invisible and isolated, cut off from the community that the synagogue ruler's family enjoyed. Their stories had run alongside each other for more than a decade, unknown to each other, until Jesus brought them together in a crowded street and revealed that he had time for both, compassion for both, healing for both. Consider the contrast that distinguished them. Jairus was named, the woman anonymous. He was powerful, she marginalized. He approached Jesus publicly, she touched him secretly. He asked for help, she took it without asking. The synagogue ruler represented everything respectable in Jewish society: male, wealthy, religiously connected, socially prominent. The hemorrhaging woman represented the opposite: female in a patriarchal culture, impoverished by medical expenses, religiously excluded by her condition, socially invisible in her suffering. If Jesus had healed only Jairus' daughter, it might have seemed that his power was available primarily to the privileged, that the influential could access grace more readily than the forgotten. If he had healed only the bleeding woman, it might have seemed that his compassion was reserved for the marginalized, that the respectable were excluded from his concern. By healing both, by stopping for both, by calling both of them into relationship, one as a restored daughter, one as a restored child, Jesus demonstrated that his kingdom operated on principles that transcended the social hierarchies of first-century Palestine. Consider the interruption that connected them. Jairus had to wait while Jesus attended to the woman, had to watch his daughter's remaining moments slip away while the teacher stopped for someone else's crisis. From the synagogue ruler's perspective, this delay was agonizing, inexplicable, a test of faith that pushed him to the breaking point. But from a wider perspective, the perspective that sees both daughters, both sufferings, both healings, the interruption was not a failure of divine attention but an expression of divine character. Jesus would not sacrifice one daughter for another. He would not hurry past the forgotten woman to reach the famous man's child. He had time for both because both mattered, because the kingdom he proclaimed made room for every desperate soul who reached for him, because the grace he carried was not a limited resource that had to be rationed among competing claims. This is perhaps the hardest lesson the story teaches, that divine timing often looks like divine indifference, that the delays we experience are not always obstacles to be overcome, but opportunities for deeper faith to develop. Jairus could not understand standing in that crowded street watching Jesus speak to a stranger while his daughter faded toward death, why the teacher had stopped. The interruption seemed cruel, arbitrary, a pointless delay that would cost him everything he loved. But the interruption was also preparation. Preparation for the even greater test that awaited when the servants arrived with news that the girl had died. Preparation for the impossible command to keep believing when belief no longer made any sense. Preparation for the revelation that Jesus' power extended beyond healing to resurrection itself. If Jairus had reached his home while his daughter still breathed, he would have witnessed a miracle of healing. Because he was delayed, because the woman interrupted, because the worst news came before Jesus arrived, he witnessed something far greater, the defeat of death itself, the calling back of a departed spirit, the demonstration that no situation was beyond the reach of the one he had sought at the shore. The delays we experience in our own lives rarely come with explanations attached. We pray and heaven seems silent. We cry out and the answer does not arrive on our schedule. We watch the hours slip away, the opportunities close, the possibilities narrow toward outcomes we dread, and we wonder why a God who claims to love us does not act when action seems most urgent. The story of Jairus offers no easy answers to these questions, no formula for understanding why divine timing so often differs from human preference, but it offers something perhaps more valuable, a witness, a testimony, an account of one father who walked through the valley of the shadow of death and discovered on the other side that the shadow was not the final word. Jairus believed when belief made sense, and then he believed when belief seemed foolish, and then he believed when belief appeared impossible. And he discovered that the God who had seemed absent was present all along, working toward an outcome that exceeded his most desperate prayers. The miracle in Capernaum was not the end of death. The girl Jesus raised would eventually die again, her mortal body subject to the same decay that claims every human life. She was given years, perhaps decades, of additional existence, time to grow into womanhood, perhaps to marry and bear children of her own, to live the future her illness had threatened to steal. But eventually, inevitably, death would return for her, as it returns for everyone, and this time there would be no teacher standing beside her bed, no Aramaic words summoning her back from the grave. The resurrection she experienced was temporary, a preview rather than the final product, a sign pointing towards something greater yet to come. But that sign was significant precisely because it was a sign, an indication of the direction in which God's power moved, a declaration of divine intent regarding the enemy that had haunted humanity since the garden. When Jesus stood beside the bed of a dead girl and spoke the words that recalled her to life, he was revealing something about the ultimate trajectory of his mission. He had not come merely to teach wisdom or model righteousness or provide an example of ethical living. He had come to defeat death itself, to break the power of the grave, to open a way through the final barrier that separated humanity from the eternal life for which it had been created. The raising of Jairus' daughter was a preview of Easter, a small-scale demonstration of the power that would be unleashed when Jesus himself emerged from the tomb 3 days after his crucifixion. What happened in one house in Capernaum would happen on a cosmic scale at an empty garden tomb. Death reversed, the grave defeated, life triumphant over the enemy that had held humanity captive since Adam's fall. This is the legacy of one life saved in an obscure Galilean town 2,000 years ago. Not merely a family reunion, not merely a father's joy restored, but a proclamation that echoed through history and echoes still. Death is not the final word. The grave is not the ultimate destination. The God who spoke 2 Aramaic words and recalled a 12-year-old girl from the realm of the dead intends to speak those words over all who belong to him, intends to call back from death every soul that has trusted in his promise, intends to complete on a universal scale what he demonstrated in miniature beside a child's bed in Capernaum. The afternoon had begun with a desperate father pushing through crowds, willing to risk everything for the chance that a controversial teacher might heal his dying daughter. It ended with that same father holding a living child in his arms, understanding in the depths of his being that he had encountered something, someone, beyond all categories and expectations. Between those 2 moments stretched a journey that compressed a lifetime of spiritual growth into a few agonizing hours. The surrender of pride when Jairus prostrated himself in the dust, the test of patience when Jesus stopped for the hemorrhaging woman, the crucible of faith when servants announced that the girl had died, the impossible obedience of continuing to believe when belief made no sense, and finally, the overwhelming encounter with resurrection power that rewrote everything Jairus thought he knew about the limits of the possible. The sun had set completely over the Sea of Galilee by the time the household settled into the quiet rhythms of evening. Lamps that had been extinguished as symbols of death were relit to illuminate the celebration of life. The sounds of mourning that had filled the house just hours earlier had given way to laughter and the gentle clatter of a meal shared by a family reunited. Somewhere in that house, a 12-year-old girl was falling asleep in the same bed where she had died, her breathing steady and sure, her body whole and healthy, her future restored by 2 words spoken in her mother tongue by a man who commanded death the way other men commanded servants. And somewhere in the streets of Capernaum, walking back toward the shore where the day had begun, Jesus continued on his way, toward other crowds and other crises, toward other desperate souls who would reach for him in their extremity, toward a cross that awaited him in Jerusalem and an empty tomb that would vindicate everything he had claimed. The teacher who had stopped for one suffering woman and one dying girl would soon stop for the entire world, laying down his life so that death itself might be defeated, rising again so that all who believed in him might share in his victory over the grave. The story of Jairus' daughter is, in the end, an invitation. It invites us to consider what we believe about the one who walked the shores of Galilee 2 millennia ago, whether he was merely a teacher of wisdom or something infinitely more, whether his power extended only to moral instruction or reached into the very structure of reality, whether his concern was limited to the spiritual realm or encompassed the full range of human need, including the physical, the emotional, the desperate cries of fathers watching their children slip away. It invites us to examine our own moments of desperation, the times when we have reached the end of our resources and found ourselves face to face with circumstances we cannot control, outcomes we cannot guarantee, fears we cannot quiet on our own. And it invites us to hear, in the midst of our worst moments, the words that Jesus spoke to a devastated synagogue ruler on a crowded street in Capernaum. Do not fear, only believe. The words are not a promise that every story will end the way Jairus' story ended, that every prayer will be answered with resurrection, that every desperate plea will result in the outcome we desire. They are something different, and perhaps something deeper. They are an invitation to trust in a God who sees the individual in the crowd, who stops for the suffering, even when important missions seem to demand haste, who has power over death itself and intends to use that power on behalf of all who belong to him. They are an invitation to keep believing even when circumstances scream that belief is foolish, to hold on to faith even when the worst news has already arrived, to follow Jesus into rooms where death seems to have won because death has never yet had the final word in his presence. The daughter of Jairus was given back to her father on an afternoon in Capernaum, and a hemorrhaging woman was given back to herself on the same day, and both of them carried into their futures the memory of a teacher who had time for their desperation, power for their need, compassion that noticed them amid all the pressing claims that competed for his attention. 2,000 years later, the same invitation extends to everyone who hears their story, to bring our desperation to the one who still has time, still has power, still has compassion, that notices us amid all the competing claims of a world in need. Do not fear, only believe. The words echo across the centuries, from a crowded street in Galilee to wherever we find ourselves today, carrying the same promise they carried when a devastated father first heard them. That fear and faith may stand side by side in our hearts, that doubt and trust may coexist in the same trembling soul, but that the one who speaks these words has authority over every circumstance we will ever face, including the last enemy, the final threshold, the boundary that seems most absolute. Jairus believed, and his daughter lived. The invitation remains open, and the God who spoke life into a dead girl's ears is still speaking, still calling, still willing to meet us in our desperation with power beyond our imagining. The story ends, but its echoes never fade. In every generation, in every corner of the world, the words still sound, Talitha cum. Little one, arise, and death, when it hears that voice, has no choice but to let go.